Okay. So what we're going to be going over the next week or two is kind of some introductory theories to helping and effective helping models to kind of get us kind of acclimated into the idea that what we are truly here to do is to help people create change in their life through the group process. And when we think about helping, whether we're helping another individual or helping several other people or a group or a community, helping is a group process. And the person who is the facilitator of that help is part of that community by simply being there. The facilitator is not an independent part that comes in and is impartial. The facilitator is now involved. They're part of the group. And so through this course, we'll talk about things well, that are important, such as ethics. Oh, whoops. Like I say, someone says they cannot see the screen, so I'm going to stop sharing and reshare. Hopefully that's better. Can everyone let me know if you can see the screen or not? Okay. 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 Good, good, good. Okay. All right. So going back to this example, hmm, change. Okay. So it shows that it's being shared. So Delisa, what I would recommend is on Canvas, there's a copy of these this presentation if you can follow along and just in case you can't still see it. Okay. But to continue on, one of probably I had an experience when I was younger about really what I think exemplifies a group and the group helping process. Mm. I was raised and born and spent some of my adult life in Idaho and Montana and Wyoming. And kind of like what we do here, if we want to have a getaway, maybe we go to Rocky Point or camping somewhere or to the mountains, Flagstaff. What most people do in the area that I come from is we go to Yellowstone National Park. That was kind of our getaway. At the time, my father-in-law who's right here, he had an Infinity for um, for going to the park, and what he really prized himself on is finding grizzly bears. That's what we'd spend most of our weekends and whatnot looking for. I never understood why we couldn't just do sweet little tender birdies and other things, but he wanted to go find grizzly bears. But something that what then was very common is if you wanted to see really grizzly bears during that time, you had to go off the beaten track. And throughout Yellowstone, there's these off roads that are kind of what you would say one way in and one way out. There's in a lot of these roads, there's not a place where you can turn around. You kind of have to go through one end and come out the other, because there's a steep cliff on one side and a ledge on the other and whatnot. So we went on one of these roads this spring, and that winter we had really heavy snow and a really wet, warm spring, which made the ground very saturated and a lot of the vegetation very loose. And one time we were going down this road, a microburst hit and it knocked over a tree across the road. And we came up and there was about 6 or 7 cars ahead of us, and we're wondering what's going on. And so me and my then father-in-law got out and we walked, and we came across this tree across the road. And we noticed that there was people around the tree, and they had various items on top of the tree. There was a little hatchet, there was even a car jack, a hammer, some rope. Something that's not on here that I always thought was kind of a little strange being there was a blanket. I don't know if they were trying to keep the tree warm or what, but there was a blanket there. And around this tree were fairly intelligent people. There was a construction worker, there was a teacher, there was even an architect, there was just individuals who you would think have relatively good intelligence and whatnot, and thoughtful about their world. And they were stuck on how to move this tree and get it out of the way so people could get out of this narrow passage. And something you should know about it was a pine tree that was over the road. And one thing about a pine tree is it's really light at the top and it's really heavy at the bottom. Um, and as we were all staring at these tools and trying to figure out how to move the tree slightly moved. And everyone was kind of like strange. And so we looked up the tree to the top, and there was this young boy, maybe 11 or 12 years old, lifting just that top of the tree. And it's almost like the group had an aha moment. They said, well, if that kid could move the top of the tree, um, maybe all of us can move the rest of the tree and pivot it down the hill. And that's what they did, and that's how they moved the tree out of the way. And we were able to move on and get to where we wanted to be. So now, what's the point of this story that I would like to emphasize as we begin this journey in group facilitation? Is that that young boy probably represents a group facilitator in a treatment place. We're not there to change people's lives. We can't. It's impossible. What we are able to do is provide seeds and possibilities of change, of insight that lead people to their own problem-solving solutions for their given situation and their given life. The other thing that this story represents is, if you remember, I said these people came with lots of knowledge: construction worker, an architect, a teacher, a business owner. All of these individuals came with a good amount of knowledge, and they came with tools that they thought maybe would help them in trying to solve their problem, but they were stuck. They were fixed on this idea that this large, immovable thing could not be changed through things like cooperation and working together and being there and really looking at the problem from a different perspective. Okay. And so the group, that is what kind of represents a group. And most individuals, even if they don't come from the best backgrounds, come to a group setting, to a helping setting with tools that they already have ideas that could work. They come with knowledge and experience, and it's our job as a facilitator to kind of help lift those barriers and initiate the helping process. Okay. So that's kind of my little introduction to what we're really going to be focusing on for the rest of the semester is how do we effectively facilitate, hopefully change for the better for individuals suffering from a range of issues from addiction to mental health issues to trauma and the like. So that's kind of where we're headed. The other reason why I wanted to start with this story is as you develop your skills as a therapist or a social worker, if you're in the field already doing a lot of this hard work, I would encourage you to develop these stories for your own philosophy of helping and to really make it so that when you go into a helping situation, you know exactly why you're there because you have connected it with yourself personally, and the helping process personally. A lot of people come into the helping fields knowing why they're there because maybe they've experienced addiction or trauma themselves. And so they have that motivation now to help others. But what a lot of time is missing is they know how they recovered from trauma, but they haven't integrated what they're learning to become an effective helper and therapist and social worker into their narrative and into their story. And so I would encourage you to kind of use this maybe as an example or a springboard. And when we're talking about this content, create those personal stories that make it part of who you are. Okay. So let's go on. So we're going to talk about some theories. The one thing that we should note about group treatment in working with groups is even though we have been doing it on a uh, basis in human existence for eons, we've been, even we want to think back to our great ancestors who sat around a campfire, or we think about people in the Middle Ages getting together and debating and whatnot, and even up to current times where communities get together and they try to solve problems. Even though we have been collectively working on the human condition as groups since the beginning of who we really are, the formal group process, the formal treatment process, the formal in the Western United States, European world of formal group treatment really didn't start to happen until about the 1950s, where there was a influx of mental health and mental illness issues, and there just were not enough mental health providers to treat people on just the individual level. And so the group movement really started. It was in earnest 1950s, but I do want to back up 1930s, 1940s. We see things like AA and those types of groups start to develop. But its acceptance as a therapeutic model of treatment, groups really didn't take hold until the 1950s. Okay. So it as its modern form in the therapy and treatment arena, group treatment is fairly new. Um, What I want to go through is what some of the early theories and thoughts were about treatment and group therapies and those types of things. Okay. And um, one of the first people maybe we should start with, and if you've taken my Psych 101 or whatnot, you know this person quite well. But probably the first person that we should talk about, because it's going to be his daughter, Anna Freud, and some other post-neo-Freudians who really kind of push the group process, is a guy named Sigmund Freud. Okay. The reason why we're going to start with him is because a lot of his ideas are still at hold, especially in popular media. But he is also one of the first that gave the kind of a modern take on treatment and therapy. And if you want to know the origins of counseling, therapy, psychotherapy, and stuff, it really does formally start with Sigmund Freud and his colleague John Brunner, who um, we will start with Brunner. He had a famous client who came to him one day, and the client said, I'm telling all my friends about you. Um, And Bruner at the time was very confused and he asked why. And she says, well, after we see each other, my symptoms go away for a couple weeks. And then I come and see you again, and they go away for a couple again. And it's like a miracle cure. And Bruner was confused because he didn't actually give any type of medical type treatment. There was no medications, there were nothing. Basically, all that was happening is the client would come in and Bruner and the client would have a conversation and talk about what's going on in her life. And so Bruner got with Sigmund Freud and said, I don't know what's going on here. And they had some debates about it. And they developed something called the talking cure. The talking cure then became what we consider counseling, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, mental health counseling in modern times. So, kind of the modern West, especially Western version of treatment, really starts with this conversation between Freud and Brunner. But where did Sigmund Freud kind of feel like, why does a person need to go to someone who, in his mind, is trained in the art and science of mental illness and psychology, in order to alleviate their symptoms? And he came up with this idea because uh, only a trained professional has access to someone's true mental life. And he's going to say that most of the reasons we do what we do are due to unconscious drives that we're not necessarily aware of. And that these drives, the reason why they kind of mess us up sometimes is because they're in constant conflict and chaos. Okay. And the two basic drives that he promoted were things like sex and aggression. Neo-Freudians are going to add things like inferiority, superiority, and things like that. Carl Jung is going to add positive emotions as a drive. But really, the start of this started with these very conflictive drives that drive most of our mental health. The other thing that Freud is going to do in the field of counseling and therapy is he's going to say that most of our mental illnesses that derive from the unconscious occurred in early childhood and conflicts that happen between the child and the mother and the father and the family. And that is the origins of most mental illnesses. Okay. Okay. From this short picture of this, I want to emphasize just a couple points that really have influenced our view of mental health, mental illness, and the field itself. Okay. First of all, He was a genius at business, in my opinion, because he said that the only person that can really help you access your unconscious and understand what is wrong with you is a trained professional. And this has had two consequences, especially in our modern life. One, a lot of people are afraid when a person starts talking about their mental health and what's going wrong with it. We have this fear that, hey, I am not a trained professional. You need to go to someone who is trained and is knowledgeable about what you're going through. I can't help. Okay. That is probably one of the biggest fictions that Sigmund Freud really gave to us, that a common person can't help another person with basic mental health. And that's an unfortunate part about one of Freud's legacies. The second thing that Freud provided is this idea of importance of early childhood experiences. Okay. Now, this has had two consequences. One, people assume that if I go to a therapist, I'm going to have to dig up my entire past and talk about what happened in childhood and in infancy and my relationship with my parents and all of those things. And well, there are still forms of treatment like that. Most effective treatments focus on the person in the here and now, on how they're experiencing their symptoms now, not how they developed, if they developed in childhood or those kinds of things, but the what how they experience it in the here and now. And we find when a person can alleviate their symptoms here and now, that the issues from the past do not become a significant part of their mental world that ruminates in their mind about why they're where they're at. Okay. However, one important part that that did come because of this is the understanding that yes, childhood trauma does have an influence on a person's well-being. So it has greatly influenced with, I'm trying to think of the studies. Um, I'll get to it later, but dealing with childhood issues when people are children are important because it can help them stay healthier as they go into adulthood. So it did help the world of child therapy and whatnot, and understanding that the earlier we intervene, the better off the individual. So that's the positive end of Freud's legacy on that issue. Okay. So, again, these next slides are just, if you've done the Psych 101, if you could read it in the book, this just represents, the unconscious, the ego that has access to both, and how much of our world is driven by these unconscious desires and needs. What our job is, according to this model, is to understand that model. Okay. So we'll skip a lot of this because you again, if you've done Psych 101 or whatnot, it's kind of a something to understand. But I do want to emphasize the point before we get into this next conversation about do we have unconscious drives that can drive our behavior and can drive what we do? The answer is yes, but it's not the complete story. Okay. So some examples of unconscious drives is, for example, when an addict starts to trigger and start to have craving, but they don't understand why they're triggering or craving. Most of the time, it's because we do have we do process stuff unconsciously, sensations we get from our environment unconsciously before we have a conscious experience of it. So, for example, most of our sensory input goes to the limbic system and to the emotional and memory parts of the brain. And what that instantly starts to activate is an instant response. It's kind of the reason why we didn't get eaten by predators in our early years because it ignites this fight or flight response. And then a few seconds later, that information is sent up to the cortical parts of the brain where we have a conscious experience of it. A lot of times, with the example of addicts, that information that is processed on that unconscious level, the brain already starts to trigger and crave the need to use the substance that the person is addicted to. And then that information is sent up to the conscious area of the brain. And if the person is through treatment and whatnot, they're kind of like, why am I experiencing this? Why is this going on? I don't understand. Okay. And so there is, and we can see the same things that happen with trauma responses in people who are triggered through a mental health issue. That yes, so there is areas our body is prepared to respond due to stimuli that it's receiving before we're consciously aware of it. So, is there basis for understanding the unconscious ways of the body? Yes, but it's not the complete story. We still have the ability to, once we have, for example, those triggers and cravings, we do have techniques and tools we can use that will make it so we don't go into the addictive cycle. So the um, other thing that Freud kind of promoted, and especially his daughter Anna Freud, is the notion of defense mechanisms. Okay, in more Freudian and Anna Freud terms, defense mechanisms are ways we protect our ego from insult or harm. The way I'd encourage you to think about defense mechanisms is these are the methods we use to relieve our own anxieties and our own problems. Um, uh, Now, this is a part of psychoanalysis and Freudian theory that is still used much today. And there's actually been more added to them. In the modern terms, they might be called defense mechanisms. In other arenas, they can be called thinking errors.
Speaking and
And so there's a lot of different, more modern terms for this, but I kind of want to go through these at this point because what I want to encourage you to do is I want you to start recognizing these defense mechanisms in yourself and in others. Because when we get to the group process, when we're in a group and someone starts using any of these defense mechanisms, it's time for you to stop and reassess the direction you're going in the group because that person is in a defensive part of treatment. And either you need to slow down and go through the topic more slowly, or you might need to change direction and change your focus for just a little while before you come back to that. Okay. So we're going to go through these, and what I would like you to do is start in your personal world and start looking for these different defense mechanisms, watch how they progress, see how they work. And hopefully, in your own personal relationships, you could use these to understand when people are becoming defensive or are very uncomfortable with conversations that you're having with them. And so you can change your approach. Okay. So, the first one is probably one of the most common defense mechanisms that we as humans use, and that is denial. Denial is not acknowledging that there is a problem. So the most common example is a person is diagnosed with some awful chronic illness, and so they deny it and they go and look for a second or third opinion, and they just deny that there's a problem. This is very common with addiction, especially you will find if you go into what are called forced addiction groups, where this is where someone is, people are in the group because of probation, the court, or because they're in jail, and they deny that they have an addiction problem. I'm not a drinker, and they often then compare themselves to other people and whatnot and use some of these other ones. Loss of someone, one of the first initial phases of denial when someone loses someone is that um, they're not really gone. They don't face that fact of life. I have seen this in the field of relationship and domestic violence, where the survivor denies the abuse and denies that part of the reason why their partner is currently in jail, and deny that there's problems in the relationship that are detrimental. Okay, so denying the reality of the situation is often an initial response, but we will learn techniques throughout this course on how to help someone get over that denial phase. And this will be very important for those who are going into the addiction field, especially. The second one is suppression. Suppression is suppressing the memory until it disappears into the subconscious. So the example is a woman doesn't recall being raped. So I want to pause on this one because the original idea of repression is that a person consciously makes the choice to repress or push down a traumatic event into their unconscious or subconscious so they don't have to think about it or recall it or remember it. That form of repression isn't possible. A person, unless they have a form of dementia, cannot purposely forget something. Okay. And the example of this is kind of a very simple one. These tasks get more and more complex, but the example of repression that I think works well is what's called the pink elephant analogy. Okay. So if I asked you all to imagine a pink elephant in your head, it could be a stuffed pink elephant. Someone in another class mentioned that they imagined Dumbo, but I want you to put a pink elephant of some type in your head. And then if I ask the class, now forget that pink elephant, get it out of your mind. We'll take a few minutes, we'll get it out of your mind. And then I ask at the end of the few minutes, has everyone forgotten? And it's interesting because I then, students will raise their hands, or the people will raise their hands and says, I've forgotten, I've forgotten. And I ask, what did you forget? Well, the pink elephant. Well, then you didn't forget him because you remember him. Okay. Now, now, is there mechanisms for where repression occurs, but maybe more on the neurological level? That the answer to that is yes. There are biological mechanisms that the brain, which the brain's primary purpose is to keep you alive and survive. And so it really doesn't care about your feelings or emotions. It's here to keep you alive, will at times block memories and I don't mean to give your brain consciousness, but your brain feels like if you remembered it, it could potentially put you through more harm. Okay. So it's a mechanism that occurs in the limbic system between the amygdala and the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the main storage unit of the brain. The amygdala, which is just right in front of it, towards the front of the brain, is kind of the emotion part of the brain, mainly the emotion of fear that it responds to. Okay. This system can block especially very traumatic memories. And then once the individual is in a safe spot and in a safe way, the brain can then start releasing memories of that event. So I'll give two examples. One, I did work with adults who were abused as children. And oftentimes they'll tell me they didn't start to remember what they went through until they were in their 20s and sometimes even 30s. Um, and this is very common for individuals who have blocked memories from childhood trauma. Because usually what happens is the person becomes an adult. They leave their childhood home and go and be on their own. So they're now away from that environment where that abuse and hurt occurred, and they're now in a new, safer environment as an adult. And so the brain will go, there you go. Here's now that you're safe, here is these memories. In the instance of the example it gives on our slide, a woman doesn't recall being raped. When I worked with sexual assault victims, especially the ones that it was an acute, brutal sexual abuse situation, of course, we'd give services right up above, crisis counseling, all of those things. But even if I was still working with them, I always marked on my calendar to start kind of checking in on them around the ninth to about 12th month post assault, because usually by the ninth to 12th month, usually, not always, there's distance between the offender and the survivor. Family life has either changed significantly or has come back to semi-normal. The person is getting back into their regular life routines. And so the brain is at the point where it says, okay, we're safe. And this around the 9th to 12th month is when a lot of many survivors of especially acute sexual assault will start to have flashbacks, nightmares, trauma responses to certain smells and certain feelings. And so a lot of times when I got in touch with some of the survivors, they'd go, Mr. Peterson, I feel like I'm going crazy. I'm going nuts. I keep having these dreams. I keep having this, that all of a sudden I will smell a certain smell and I'll get into a fetal position and start crying. And this is where that repressed memory is now, the person is now having a recall of that. So that's repression. When you're in the group setting, um, if you start to notice your clients and whatnot go into a trauma response, it is really important at that point to kind of slow down, maybe take a group break, and just have a little individual time one-on-one with that individual. Because if they're starting to have triggering responses, which we'll go over when we get to trauma, um, this person may be having a recalled memories or recalled experiences. Okay. So that's repression. Projection is putting your own beliefs and behaviors on someone else. Talking about how stupid video games is with someone else, believing that they must feel the same way even though they never said so. Okay. Projection, if I want to put it this simply, is for example, doing addiction groups, is the person who says, I don't have an alcohol problem, but Bill over there definitely does because I drink a 12 pack a night, but he's drinking 2/5 of whiskey a night. He's an alcoholic. I'm not. I'm not that bad. Or I only binge drink during the weekend and I'm fine getting through the week, but Joe over there drinks every night of the week. So I'm not the one with the problem. Um, it is well, we'll get to another one in a minute, but it is basically saying this isn't me because I'm not as bad as so and so. And so that's a form of projection. And again, once you start seeing those things, it is a sign that your client is becoming resistant to what is being discussed in the group setting. Okay. Regression is the tendency when a person becomes overwhelmed and extremely stressed and don't feel like they can escape. They're acting in a way that is not typical of their age. So let me explain this a little bit. We have what is known as the fight or flight response. Okay. And this is when we feel endangered by something, our body starts to release endorphins. Blood flow goes from the center of our body to our extremities, getting us ready to either fight or run. And our body is preparing for a stress reaction. Okay. Well, the same thing is happening in the brain. Okay. The blood flow and the energy in the brain go from the higher cortical rational parts of the brain down to the limbic, if you want to put it, reptilian areas of the brain, in order to prepare us to fight or flight. Okay. And what the limbic system is going to use in that reaction is our most well learned behaviors and responses. Our most well learned behaviors and responses are between the age of 3 and 6. Those are things that are ingrained in our head. If we're not thinking about it, that's how we're going to respond. Okay. So, to give just some literal examples of regression, let's talk about an argument with a partner. Okay, so let's the example I give in Intro to Psychology is the argument over leaving the bread out. So you and your partner come up with an agreement that we need to start putting the bread away, wrapping it up so it doesn't go bad soon. And then I know this sounds like a silly example, but maybe let's say you get home one day and you see, oh no, the bread was left out again. Okay. What we do rationally, I hope, what we do rationally is we come up with how we're going to approach our partner when they get home. We're going to have this conversation again, and we're going to give the reasons and the rationale of why we need to put away the bread and maybe come up with ways we can make sure that this doesn't happen again. Okay. Uh, for the most part, sometimes it's a little bit more emotionally charged, but I think that's kind of what the goal is when we're faced with some simple challenges and whatnot. But what happens when the partner gets home? Well, when the partner gets home, you say, honey, we need to talk about the bread. And of course, you can already imagine in your mind what's happening. That person is rolling their eyes in their head and they're already starting to be defensive. It's like, oh, I forgot. Well, no, we don't need to talk about that. Yes, we need to talk about this. And then what happens a good amount of time is you start the petty name calling like you would as a kid. You do the physical aggressing, maybe the folding your arms or kind of slapping at each other and those kinds of things. And if it's not resolved at that point, it turns into a childlike fight because both have gone through regression. And they have lost their rational ability to really get through this in a rational way. And that's why most couples therapists, the first thing they teach a couple is when things get emotionally charged, um, um, they teach clients to take care of that emotion physically. So they have the client, the two pairs separate from each other. They do one maybe goes for a walk, the other goes and does something to calm themselves down physiologically and start to get that blood flow back up into the higher areas of the brain where we could rationally have a conversation. Okay, that's one example. The other example, maybe I'll say for another time, but in the group setting, when you notice individuals start to physically get into more of a fetal position, more of a child stance, they start using more child language, and those types of things. Again, this is where you need to pause, stop, and really figure out what is going on in the group that is making this trigger occur. Okay. The other one is something called displacement. And this is showing emotions towards someone or something completely unrelated to which caused your emotions. If you've worked with people who go to jail or inmates, this is just like denial is probably one of the most common strategies they use. So when I used to do treatment with offenders who especially were just in the beginning phases, and I asked them why they were here, and they would say something like, I had a crappy attorney, that stupid judge, that police officer, the person who called the cops, uh, and they're taking their behavior because they can't emotionally deal with what they did, and they're putting the fault on the system, the judge, the attorneys, the witnesses, everyone else but themselves. Okay. And just like this example, of alcoholic gets in a car accident driving drunk and he blames his wife who is at home. Okay. Again, especially when working with individuals who commit a behavior that is either bad for them, such as addiction, drugs, and alcohol, or criminal behaviors. This is a very common thing in the beginning of a treatment process. And the way that I would use this one is when you start seeing the use of displacement over time, you know you're heading in the right direction. Okay. And then the last one we'll talk about for today is rationalization. This is when a rapist thinks that since the girl is raping, looks at him seductively, it must be okay. Rationalization, I think, in the best terms, is what we call victim blaming. Okay. And victim blaming is probably the best example of rationalization. Now, why do we victim blame? And the reason is one, if we're not the offender, it separates us from them. It makes us feel like because I don't dress like them, because I don't act like them, I am not at risk of being offended myself. So, for example, the person who is sexually assaulted, we often say it was because of their clothes, the way they dress, the way they da 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 da, and so that psychologically separates the individual from thinking that they could potentially be that. For the offender, you can almost see rationalization as excuse making, especially when it comes to things like victim blaming. So thinking that, well, they wanted it because this is what happens when human beings act this way. This is a natural consequence of that person's action, not mine. When we deal, for example, with drunk drivers, you probably have heard many people who drink and drive say they drive better when they're drunk. and rationalize in those forms that, hey, I can do this because I'm actually better at it when I'm loaded. Okay. And again, the goal with displacement and rationalization is these are usually beginning parts of the group process. These are very commonly used along with denial. And what we want to see is less use of these over time. And that's a good way to gauge success in the treatment process. Okay. So again, what I want for us today is I want you to kind of go back and look at these in the slides in the Canvas classroom, kind of get an understanding of them. And on your own level, I want you to start recognizing these. And then you'll notice that I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to stop recording.